Fire Emblem is in something of a renaissance when it comes to ROM hacking. 2024 was a big year, with a lot of releases, many of which look really good. But 3 2024 releases seem to stand out from the rest, in terms of their popularity and reception. And these are referred to by the community as the Big Three, since they came out around the same time as each other and were all hotly anticipated projects. I already did a video on one of these, the Morrow's Golden Country, although for some reason I referred to it in the video as the Morrow's Golden Sorrow. But the other two were Cerulean Crescent, a hack that pushes the mechanics of Fire Emblem to their absolute wackiest limits, and Dream of Five, which does the exact opposite, focusing on an experience as close to the Game Boy Advance games as possible, explicitly acting as a throwback to one of the oldest cancel hacks of all time, Dream of Five. I had my patrons vote on which of these games I would tackle next, and they decided on Dream of Five. So, throw on your nostalgia goggles for a treasure from over a decade ago. Fire Emblem, Dream of Five. I'll start by talking about something that I usually gloss over in these reviews, and that is the aesthetics of Dream of Five. For many people, the Game Boy Advance sprites represent the peak of Fire Emblem graphics, with fancy and fluid animations that feel so much better than the lifeless ones we get in 3D games. This is almost certainly a part of why so many hacks are made in the Fire Emblem 8 engine, although there is also the fact that we know more about how to hack FE8 than any other game. But one thing that I feel like isn't talked about that often is how the aesthetics can kind of clash with each other, especially in FE8, as the art styles of FE6, 7, and 8 are subtly different. The animations that are new to the Sacred Stones, such as Ranger and Great Knight or the General Sword animation, just don't feel like they belong alongside the ones that originated in the Binding Blade. To a lesser extent, the same can be said about the Blazing Sword's new animations, such as the Hector and Lyn ones, although I think at the very least they feel more like they belong in Alib than the new ones from FE8. This same problem sometimes applies to ROM hacks as well, and can be especially jarring when it comes to portraits, as oftentimes generic units or bosses use splices or just straight up generic portraits from the Game Boy Advance games, and these can feel a little out of place alongside original portraits, especially if the original portraits were made by multiple spriters and have subtle differences in their style. Don't get me wrong, I don't see this as some sort of damning criticism. The Game Boy Advance era is still the most beautiful Fire Emblem's ever been, and ROM hacks continue that tradition with really good looking portraits. The main reason I bring this up is that Dream of Five does not fall into this pitfall. All of its portraits, including those of unimportant bosses and even generic soldiers, are custom made in a style that is only present in Dream of Five. And as a result of that, it feels a lot more cohesive as a work, closer to an indie game than a fan game, if that makes any sense. But it's not just that they look like each other. Obviously, this is an incredibly subjective take, but everything in reviews is subjective. And I think the art style in Dream of Five is gorgeous, easily the best that I've had in any ROM hack I've played. The characters feel expressive in their portraits, and main story characters have multiple portraits not just because of their different classes, but also because of their different expressions and moods in the story. For example, Rena looks different when she's addressing people in a more formal royal setting than in a casual setting as the leader of the army. Now, you might be confused as to why I mentioned different classes, and that's because, much like with the previous game I covered, TMGC, promoting in Dream of Five gives you a new portrait. And the ways in which these characters change are really cool. And I ended up promoting a bunch of filler units just because I wanted to see what fancy hats or eye patches they got. But aesthetics goes beyond simply the portraits. The animations were also all top-notch. Many of them came from the repo, but the specific choices for what armors and soldiers and sword fighters do seemed to complement each other, so it all worked together like a single smooth system. And I don't really know how to describe it, but the generic soldier portraits felt like the things that are supposed to go with those animations. I don't really know why, it did, it felt right. But in addition to everything being drawn and animated well, there were some cool decisions in how the visuals tied into the story of Dream of Five. You start the story out by fighting bandits, because this is a Fire Emblem game after all, and you're controlling blue units fighting against red units. But after the early chapters, you are betrayed by one of your patrons and framed as villains, and as a result of this, you need to fight through some former allies. And at this point, the enemy army is coded green. While this definitely confused some people in my stream chat, I personally think it was a really cool choice, because it shows that each color corresponded with a specific faction, and that continued when we crossed the border and ended up clashing against purple units. Later in the story, there were points where we were fighting against people from multiple factions that just happened to ally with each other, and as a result of this, different units had different color coding. But speaking of the story, I would argue this is probably the biggest selling point for Dream of Five. It's very distinct from the standard Fire Emblem fare. Usually you play a lord who's reclaiming their homeland or fighting an evil dragon or something like that, but you start out playing as a mercenary, although she's not just a mercenary, as she's soon revealed to be a lost princess who wants to reclaim her birthright of the throne. Although this is a lie, she's actually an imposter, somebody who looks similar to a princess that died a while ago, put in place by one of her advisors who's trying to make a power grab. And if this sounds like a spoiler, it isn't really. Dream of Five is very upfront about this information, and in fact, most developments in the plot are not only heavily foreshadowed, but oftentimes just outright told to you. In fact, the first scene in the story is a flash forward to one of the last interactions between two of the main characters. So despite the fact that the plot of Dream of Five involves a lot of politicking, with various people and factions knowing and discovering each other's secrets, I would hesitate to call this plot political intrigue, because it really doesn't try to have any sort of twists. We know most characters' motivations and the endpoints they are trying to achieve, so it's mostly a matter of seeing whose ambitions will be successful and who's going to fall short. But it's not just a story of nations like Fire Emblem 6. Because Dream of Five does a lot of work making you care about the primary, tertiary, and secondary characters, showing us the relationships between these people and how they grow and evolve over time, not just within the support menu, but also within the story itself, as oftentimes the cutscenes between chapters will feature conversations between the various members of your army, delving a little bit into their backstories. This is made possible in part due to the large scale that the story has, particularly in terms of time. Most of the chapters take place days, weeks, or even months in between each other, since you're only really playing out main battles. The events that occur in between these maps are explained through Rena's journal, which also gives us an insight into her inner thought process, allowing us, the player, to more closely identify with her and her perspective. Which is good because I would say the emotional core of the narrative involves understanding why Rena acts the way that she does, even though it is seemingly illogical. Because from the get-go, it's pretty clear that her advisor, Varcade, is manipulating her and does not care whatsoever whether she lives or dies, only using her to get his own means accomplished. The two of them consistently clash, and Rena is the one with an actual position of authority, since she is the one pretending to be a princess, yet she always defers to him, even against the wishes of her actual friends. But the reason for this is that Rena is, in many ways, an abused child to Varcade. Sure, he's not actually her father, and he has no love for her. In fact, I would say he's probably not capable of love. But in many ways, she is still the scared little girl who lived in the dungeon that he treated kindly, even if it was just a form of manipulation. So her inability to cast him out, even as his manipulations become more and more clear, is the sort of thing that the player could feel disconnected from if they don't identify with Rena, which is why I think the journals and the POV are so important to making the story impactful. Although, if the thing that you're interested in is the different clashes of nations, there's plenty there too. We learn about the culture of all of these different places, and there's even a branching path partway through the story where you can choose to either go A route or B route, each of which will take you to a different story and introduce you to a different secondary character first, since this game has 3 lords, similar to Lynn Elliewood and Hector. Whichever branch you choose to go on is going to impact an entire arc of the story. But not only that, the consequences of who you ally with will ripple forward into the final act as well, such that even the story of the final few maps is going to be different depending on which route you went. Considering how much I liked the story on my first playthrough, this feels like the perfect thing to motivate me to go back for a second serving, which many ROM hacks can fail to do. But I didn't actually do a second playthrough of Dream of 5. And that's because, for as much as I truly enjoyed the story, I really did not like the gameplay. Broadly, this game aims to emulate the era of FE 6, 7, and 8, and as such, some of the mechanical complexities of other Fire Emblem games are absent. There's no skills, no reclassing, and promotions only go a single way instead of branching. This pretty severely limits the tactical options that you have in your army. And this makes much of the cast blend together, without the distinction that modern Fire Emblem or even the old NES ones offers. Whether it be the limited reclassing sets of the 3DS games, or the skills in Genealogy and Thracia, traditionally Fire Emblem units have something beyond their class and stat line to differentiate from each other, but that isn't really the case in Dream of 5. Which led to a lot of instances of getting units who were just outclassed by the people I already had, and therefore didn't have a chance of being added to my team. I trained up the early Anima Mage, so when I got Anima Mage number 3, 4, and 5, they didn't really give me a reason to add them to the squad. And for that matter, it's not just units within the same class who failed to feel distinct. The only real difference between my early soldier and my early axe fighter is what segment of the weapon triangle they're on. Even some traditionally different classes kind of blend together, as light and dark mages just felt like lesser versions of Anima due to lacking any 3 range, and the various sorties didn't distinguish themselves either, including thieves who were implemented in such a weird and feel-bad way. You get 3 throughout the course of the campaign, and in theory there is some cool stuff with them. Unpromoted thieves can use lockpicks, and promoted thieves get lock touch to not consume lockpicks. And regardless of the tier, they are able to steal items from enemies. Although, unfortunately, there is exactly one stealable item in the game: a Constitution stat booster. You get the first thief early on, and I tried training him early just because I wanted to have someone who could steal stuff. But aside from the map directly after he joins, there were no chapters that had chests until I got to the route split, at which point I was handed another thief. This thief was level 10 and just had better stats than my starting thief Chester around the board, meaning that Chester had exactly 1 map of thief utility before he was strictly outclassed. But even if I loved Chester with all of my heart, which I'll be honest I didn't, there wasn't even the option to bring him on that map, because it was one of the gimmick maps, and my entire squad was chosen for me. I was only allowed to use the main lord, the Jagan, and then a bunch of new units who were force deployed, including the thief. So I couldn't even hashtag just use both. But you know what they say, what goes around comes around, and this new thief was also outclassed the next time there was a unique bit of thief utility, because on the map where there was the only stealable item in the game, I got my third thief, who was a pre-promoted rogue and had better stats than my hyper-invested thief from the second one. Because the second thief became a meme in the stream. I fed her a bunch of kills, trained her up really high because me and chat liked her a bunch. Her name was Marie, she had a beautiful portrait, and I made the joke, "They're minerals, Marie," because I'm a Breaking Bad fan. But even with all of that absurd favoritism, she was outclassed by the new thief. So once again, there's no point to thief utility. But then, on the map where he's force deployed, is the only stealable in the game. Like, technically there are chests, and so using lock touch is a useful thing that the thieves can do, and they have extra fog vision, which is nice on the few Fog of War maps. But otherwise, they're just generic sword combat units who have an entirely useless ability to steal items and are outclassed by my actual combat units. It's just such a feel-bad situation. I guess the point is they were supposed to be the Myrmidon equivalents because the only other fast sword user has a unique class with convoy access, but I feel like this was not communicated because, again, they have the ability to steal, it's just there's nothing to steal. Technically, enemy thieves have lockpicks sometimes that you can steal and sell because you don't need them because you get lock touch, so I don't fucking know. It feels so bad. It's such bizarre design. But speaking of promotion, the way the promotion works in Dream of Five is also kind of weird. I mentioned that it doesn't have the split promotion introduced in Fire Emblem 8 and brought back in the 3DS games, as well as the Switch ones, but honestly, I don't think this is a huge loss. I've definitely played a bunch of ROM hacks that have single promotion paths and still feel good about it. The bigger issue is that promotion just does not feel particularly impactful. The game uses the Fates EXP formula, so if you are promoted, you're going to get a lot less experience than an unpromoted unit would. And as a result of this, you want to gain quite a bit from promotion. You get extra stats, and some characters get an extra weapon, but nobody gets movement on promotion. And because of the lack of skills, you don't have that to look forward to from promoting either. As a result, it just kind of feels Like, obviously you get extra stats and that's nice, but it doesn't feel like the upgrade promoting should, especially for the EXP loss. Oftentimes the extra weapon just isn't a big deal. If my Wyvern can use lances and axes, that's cool, but they're also fine if they just use axes, especially since both Wyverns are gonna have the same movement values. And for the units who don't get any extra weapons on promotion, it feels extra bad. Trisha, the convoy girl, gets a glow up to her portrait and a really cool sprite, but no extra weapon type, no extra movement, no extra skills, and not even a crit bonus. To the point where when I promoted her on stream, there was audible confusion because I thought I was missing something. I guess she got resistance, that's kinda cool. I don't know, it just felt really unimpactful. It's not all negatives though. Dream of Five does add a couple of features to open things up as compared to the Elite games. Infantry are able to shove other units, which helps out in terms of movement. There's several characters with personal weapons, I would say more than the average Fire Emblem game, as not only do all three of the lords get 2, but a couple of random secondary characters get PRFs as well. Additionally, some of the weapons have been reworked from vanilla GBA to give a different feel. Anima Magic now features Thunder, which is 3 range, similar to games like Three Houses, Echoes, and Engage. And yes, I'm aware that for some reason, despite Three Houses including 3 range spells, Thunder is only 1/2 range, but Three Houses is a very silly game, so we can just ignore it. It's not just mages who get access to extra range weapons, however. Longbows now come in multiple tiers, with iron, steel, and silver longbows available. This means that your own archers are now able to attack even 1-2 range enemies uncountered. But on the flip side, enemies with longbows are going to be able to pelt you without facing retaliation. And especially in the early game and mid game, longbows on enemies are far more common than the ones you are given access to. I'm of 2 minds about this, because it seems like the intention is to limit the effectiveness of 1-2 range spam, which I think is a good thing. But 1-2 range is already nerfed thanks to its power and weight being adjusted, so the large number of longbows kind of just feels like an annoyance, constantly getting peppered by their attacks in an already pretty offense-focused game. But this is a minor quibble. By far my biggest frustration with the gameplay is the map design just feels really scattershot. I struggle to remember a specific map that stands out for positive reasons, with the majority of them kind of just blending together. I vaguely remember choking a one-tile-away point, pushing my way through some foggy cliffs, fighting against enemy formations that honestly felt kind of randomly put on the map, maneuvering around bow knights who for some reason were all equipped with swords, or pressing my way across wide open fields in order to kill multiple bosses. But these moments all come from different chapters and kind of just blend together in a blur of mediocrity, I guess? These maps weren't entirely devoid of joy, but much of it was player-made. Chat and I deciding that specific characters were the most epic pilled goats of all time, and heavily investing in them, or laughing at low percent crits, or dodging high percent hits. The most distinct things that the game brought to the table were just frustrations, and many of them came from the way that the route split was implemented. I didn't have strong feelings about A route or B route, so I let chat decide by posting a poll on my community tab. There was a note before choosing that told me A route would be more experimental and B route would be more vanilla but with tight time limits, and chat decided to send me down the experimental route, in part because you get some lesbians that fall into the Penton Louise archetype, starting with an A support. But I'll be honest, these experimental maps were some of the worst Fire Emblem I've ever played. Your army gets split up and you have specific units who are force deployed on specific maps. And in fairness, the game warns you to keep weapons in even your benchwarmer's inventory. But the gold is incredibly tight at this point, making it so that keeping weapons on benched units feels like a pretty significant detriment. So I honestly don't know why we couldn't always have a prep screen to ensure that the force deployed people have the proper equipment for the challenges they're going to face. Because even if you keep stuff on all of the bench warmers, it's very possible for a map to trip you up. For example, the staffer that I was using, I left the Illuminate staff on, because I wanted to be able to see in Fog of War if there was a Fog of War map coming up. But unfortunately, there was a Fog of War map, it just was the one where I had a different staffer force deployed and couldn't use the person I gave the torch staff to. Since you can't access the convoy during this branch of the map, I was just kind of SOL, which is unfortunate because that fog map is kind of bullshit. There's a bunch of flyers swarming at you and a scary hero boss and just some absolute nonsense. I applaud the idea, especially since the story wants to make me care about all these secondary characters, but from a gameplay perspective, it was just very frustrating to not only not have a choice over who's getting deployed, but be explicitly punished for not having information the game refused to provide me. But speaking of the game not giving appropriate information, let's talk about perhaps my biggest frustration when it comes to Dream of 5. The fact that the game feels allergic to quality of life. Over the last few years, Fire Emblem ROM hacking has expanded to the point where there's a lot of quality of life features that are kind of just considered standard in Fire Emblem hacks. The ability to cancel animations with the L button, the ability to check growths by hitting select, the ability to see what items are in a unit's inventory just on a highlight, all of these are very nice, and Dream of 5 avoids adding them. It does add some QOL features, the most prominent among them being the ability to check enemy range, as well as explanation points when someone has an effective weapon, but the ones included and the ones left out feel almost arbitrary. The most confusing of them is the lack of the ability to check growths. I initially thought in part this was because of the throwback to Fire Emblem 7, but I've been told that the hack creator just does not like having revealed growths in their games. If the idea is to keep growths hidden, then I guess that's fair enough. Even though I personally like to know what I'm getting into before investing experience into a unit, I recognize this isn't a universal desire, and there are some people who enjoy surprises, like Anna from Engage having a higher magic growth than you would expect. But the goal does not seem to be to keep this information hidden, because the hack's creator made an external website that listed all of the character growths on it. So you do have the ability to check them, there's just an extra barrier in the way. And I find that really weird. I don't like the idea of being forced to play a game with an additional tab open. I know there's some people who will defend things like Awakening's ambush spawns or the fog wyverns in Arcadia by saying you can just pull up Microsoft Edge and look at online resources. And likewise, there were people in my chat defending the hidden growths with the fact you could just find them online, or by saying that characters just have the growths you would expect. But maybe people's expectations were different from mine, because even early on, there were plenty of characters who just did not have what I would expect growth-wise from them. There's a fighter with a high strength stat but a low speed stat, but his speed growth is higher than his strength growth by a significant margin. And there's a training project Est Armor Knight who doesn't even have impressive growths as compared to the other units. Maybe my expectations were just skewed, but I ran into plenty of examples where people would tell me what the growths are and they just did not align with the character's stat spread. This is probably a bigger deal for me than it would be to some other people, but it was a shadow hanging over my entire playthrough and leading to some frustrations, especially in combination with the other frustrations I had with the UI and QOL, namely the display when you highlight enemies. It's fairly standard to show off things like AS, the bulk, the attack, and the items in a unit's inventory. And Dream of 5 did have something akin to this when you highlighted enemies, but for whatever reason, instead of showing all of the items in a unit's inventory, it just showed their currently equipped weapon. So if you wanted to know what all they had available to them, you had to go into the full stat screen. Not the hugest deal in the world, it's the sort of thing you would have to do in vanilla Game Boy Advance games anyway, but I feel like at this point we've moved past saying that vanilla Game Boy Advance games QOL is good enough, especially when a higher standard has been standardized in the ROM hacking community. Game Boy Advance doesn't have animation skip, but most modern hacks come with it, and I would derive those that don't. Dream of 5 does technically have animation skip, but it implements it in a really clumsy way. Most games use the L or R button for the animation skip, but Dream of 5 uses the A button instead. And for those who haven't played the Game Boy Advance games, on enemy phase, holding down the A button is what you use to speed up enemy movement on the map. So many players, myself included, will instinctively hold down A throughout the entire enemy phase, even if they don't want to skip animations. This means that I was fighting against my instincts to not skip animations when I wanted to show them off on stream. But not only this, by not holding down A, it meant that the enemies moved at a slower speed on the map. So it was a catch-22, and I found myself engaged on enemy phase in holding down and then letting go the A button repeatedly, like it's a QuickTime event from a 360 game. Of course, there is kind of a solution to this, because if you hold down both A and L, they will cancel out the animation skip and still play the animations. But then this leads to a situation where if I'm holding down A to speed up enemy phase, and I press L to try to skip an animation, instead counterintuitively it doesn't skip the animations that I want to skip. It just became a really jumbled, frustrating mess. I've seen a couple of other hacks that use the A skip mod, and I'll be honest, this feels like the definition of anti-quality of life to me, making the game more inconvenient. But perhaps the biggest frustration I had when it came to QOL was the inclusion of random enemy stats. The way that random enemy stats work is that you do not have fixed enemy stats on the map, but instead they roll a random number, and so their stats can vary. Sometimes they'll have 2 or 3 points more speed or strength or defense or HP. And anytime you reset a map, it re-rolls the stats for all enemies. A lot of Fire Emblem games do this. I believe the feature was first implemented in Thracia and continued to be a mainstay until Fire Emblem 11, but I might be wrong about the exact titles that include it. But I think random enemy stats are the worst feature Fire Emblem has ever included. Yes, worse than ambush spawns. And my reason is twofold. The first is that if, like me, you are the sort of person who approaches a strategy game hoping to use strategy, you can't actually consistently plan out a clear of your playthrough, because the numbers that you see are going to vary from attempt to attempt. Heck, if you just look in preps and then reset the game, the numbers will be different than what you tested in preps. I like to take my time and figure out what the best approach is going to be with the tools I have access to, but you can't do that if the thresholds you need to meet keep changing. But the bigger issue is that random enemy stats significantly limit how tightly you can design a Fire Emblem map. Everyone praises Fire Emblem Engage's early game for having things like Etier one-shotting flyers in her join map and then needing to use Divine Inspiration to do so in a later map. But that's only possible because those flyers have fixed stats. Many ROM hacks take a similarly tight design to their introduction of new units, such as having a fast character who can double everyone when other units will struggle to, or a tanky unit who can survive 3 attacks. Especially in high offense games where that threshold is meaningful. In Fate's Conquest, Effie famously is 1 point short of activating Puissance on her join map, in order to teach you that Arthur Backpack is going to be a good way of getting over that Puissance threshold. In Conquest, in Dream of 5, many of the units would join with just a very bad first impression. I remember the Jaken barely missing a kill threshold, and thinking this was meant to set up kills, but then when I reset, the random enemy stats meant that he one-shot. There was a bow unit who joined in the mid-game and was just shy of killing the flyer that seemingly was positioned to be fought by him. I got units who fell just short of doubling or bulk thresholds on join, and overall, the random enemy stats just impacted the course of my playthrough so frequently that they were my biggest frustration with the mechanics. There were maps where 3 turns in I needed to do a reset and then reevaluate my entire plan because certain thresholds got rearranged, and it was very frustrating. Although I say I had to reset, but this is also not entirely true, and not just because I could have played through unit deaths, but because of the way that the game implements a turn wheel feature, in a fashion that, I'll be honest, I find kind of frustrating. I've spoken a few times on the channel about how much I love save points. It's a system introduced in Fire Emblem 11 and 12 that allows you to save partway through a map, kind of like a suspend. There will be spots on the map where you can move your units and activate the save command to save your game. Especially on longer maps, I find that this is a nearly essential feature, and I'm glad to see more and more ROM hacks embracing it. However, Dream of 5 chose to go a different way in order to justify its large maps, and instead implemented a rewind system, allowing you to rewind to the beginning of the most recent turn by resetting and clicking the resume button. This functionally was an infinite use turn wheel that could only rewind by 1 turn, and I'll be honest, I made use of it towards the end of the campaign because I kind of just wanted to be finished playing, but towards the beginning and middle, I didn't, and that's because I felt like it removed all stakes from the playthrough. If I could just undo every single mistake with no consequence whatsoever, then what really is the point of playing this high-stakes life and death game? Don't get me wrong, including this turn wheel is definitely better than having no option, especially considering the size of some of Dream of 5's maps. But I already think modern Fire Emblem gives you too many uses of turn wheel. Giving me infinity it makes the game feel toothless. I don't need Fire Emblem to be the most challenging thing ever. In fact, most FE games that I enjoy, I wouldn't describe as masochism mode. But I want to feel like my choices really matter, and that isn't the case when I have the ability to just undo any mistake at will. This system definitely has its fans, and I know it's been used in some other hacks as well, but it's always rubbed me the wrong way. That is, of course, just a personal preference, but personal preferences are why you come to my reviews. I really didn't enjoy Dream of Five. I finished it because I was streaming it and because I was interested in the story, but despite wanting to see what went down on the other route and caring about some of the support conversations between secondary characters, I don't have the motivation to go back. It just was distinctly unfun for me. But I recognize that not everyone comes to Fire Emblem for the same things. I crave deep tactical gameplay and tightly designed maps, and Dream of Five didn't have that on offer. But it did offer a better story than we've seen Intelligent Systems write, and some lovable anime protagonists, including plenty of queer folks and people of color. So if that's what you enjoy in Fire Emblem, Dream of Five is going to have something to appeal to you. If you prefer to play by feel and by adaptation than by plans and by numbers, you might have a better time with the gameplay than I did. Although personally, I would say it's probably still held back a good degree by the maps. I know Dream of Five is popular, and in part it's kind of a throwback to the older, less refined hacks of the FE7 era. So maybe it's not fair for me to hold it to the standards of 2024's hacking renaissance. But it did come out in 2024, and it positions itself as another chapter in the storied history of Fire Emblem ROM hacks. And at least for my money, it isn't as enjoyable as the modern classics. I don't know. I'd love to hear from someone who enjoyed Dream of Five, because I know the game has its fans out there, and if you're willing to write a long comment as a sort of like alternate perspective, I will pin something positive so people can look for that as well. Since I don't want the only thoughts about it to be my negative Nancying. But as it stands, I didn't enjoy myself, and I feel like if I'm going to review the game, I want to be honest about what I felt. At the end of the day, it is all subjective, and this is just my own perspective. So if you liked Dream of Five, then, good for you. That's perfectly within your rights, and I'm happy for you. I'm jealous, in fact. I don't want to dislike things. I don't find it fun to be a hater, but I can't help how I feel. And right now, how I feel is thankful for my patrons. Thank you to Eris, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smazruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Ethan P3, Girlboss, Lizard Ballwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Calamity Callie, Theythumb, Andu, Reflect, A Clever Username of Lies, YLO1, George Granville the 7th PN, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Toaster But Really, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Anna Cabana, Belle Wenska, Dysike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Roman Kormancic, Nick Nack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Heistiklop, Bree, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey, Some Trades, and Lilzabeth. Your support is what motivates me to keep making reviews like this, even when I don't find it super pleasant. If you're interested in joining the names in these credits, as well as gaining early access to my videos and the ability to vote on stuff like what game I'll review next, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can safely afford it. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. With that being said, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.